The Rapido River, January 20th, 1944, German flares hissed overhead, casting a pale, sickly light over the water. The men of Company E moved toward the crossing, their boots sinking into the muddy banks. A machine gun opened up from the far side, its tracers stitching across the river in flat, angry arcs. The first boat lurched forward, then another. Within minutes, German artillery found the range. Shells walked through the assembly area, throwing men and equipment into the air. The river, fast and cold, began to carry bodies downstream. This was the end of the road for many of them. Not on some distant beach or a mountain pass, but here, in a narrow European river that few Americans had ever heard of. The men who died that night were the sons of Mexican farmhands and railroad workers. They had grown up swimming in muddy creeks and picking cotton under the Texas sun. Now they were being fed into a killing ground, and the world would argue for years about who was to blame. How did these boys from the barrio end up here, in the middle of a war that was not theirs, fighting for a country that had never fully accepted them? To understand that, the story must go back 4 decades before the Rapido. Back to a time when the border between the United States and Mexico was a line on a map that people crossed freely, not because the law allowed it, but because survival demanded it. In the early summer of 1901, a widowed farmhand stood on the banks of the Rio Grande with his 2 young sons. He was 39 years old, and his wife had died just 6 months earlier. Mexico, under the iron rule of President Porfirio Diaz, offered him no future. The rich grew richer, the poor grew desperate, and the bloodshed in the streets of Coahuila was a constant reminder that staying meant risking everything. He did what thousands of desperate men had done before him. He gathered his boys, his 13-year-old son, and his 7-year-old son, and he crossed the river. The Rio Grande at the crossing near the settlement of Las Vacas was a wide, slow-moving barrier. On the other side was Del Rio, Texas, a small oasis fed by natural springs that pumped millions of gallons of fresh water every day. There was no fence, no gate, no border patrol in 1901. There was only the river and the hope that something better lay on the other side. For the 3 of them, that hope was enough. Del Rio in those days was a rough, growing border town. The Southern Pacific Railway had arrived in 1882, and with it came land developers, ranchers, and farmers. The family found work in the fields and on the ranches that dotted Valverde County. They settled in a section of town that became known as the San Felipe Barrio, a cluster of modest homes bordered by the railroad tracks and the San Felipe Creek. It was a small world, isolated and self-contained. The people here spoke Spanish, worshipped together, and looked out for one another. The creek that ran through the neighborhood became the swimming hole for the children of the barrio, a place where they could escape the heat and the dust and the unrelenting labor of the fields. It was their river, even if no one else would swim in it. The world beyond the barrio was not always welcoming. The separation was simple and unspoken. North of the railroad tracks was white territory. South of the tracks was the barrio. The children of San Felipe attended their own schools, built by the community because the Del Rio Independent School District refused to admit them. They worked alongside their fathers in the cotton fields from dawn until dusk, learning the rhythms of the harvest before they learned to read. When the stock market crashed in October of 1929, the Gutierrez family was already living hand to mouth. The Great Depression did not create their poverty, it only deepened it. The Depression brought a new kind of danger to Mexican-American families. The federal government, under President Hoover, launched what became known as the repatriation program. Immigration agents swept through barrios across the country, rounding up anyone who could not prove their legal status. They loaded men, women, and children onto trucks and trains and shipped them south to the border. The law did not distinguish between legal residents and illegal aliens, nor between adults and children born on American soil. Up to 1 million people of Mexican descent were deported during the 1930s, many of them United States citizens. The raids tore families apart, leaving women crying in the streets and children separated from their parents forever. Ramon's grandfather had died in 1938, an old man at 76, having spent his last 37 years as a Texan. His father kept the family together through sheer will and hard work. His parents raised 11 children in the San Felipe barrio, feeding them on vegetables grown in the yard and beans cooked on a wood stove. They had buried 2 infants who did not survive the harsh conditions of poverty, but they endured. They planted sugarcane and corn, took in washing, and traveled north for seasonal work in the beet fields of Idaho and the fruit orchards of the Midwest. Every dollar counted. Every meal was a small victory. The children of the barrio learned early that the world was not fair. In 1930, a group of Mexican-American parents in Del Rio filed a lawsuit against the Del Rio Independent School District. They argued that the segregation of Mexican children from white students was illegal. The local court agreed with them, ordering the district to stop construction of a separate school building. But the school district appealed, and the appellate court ruled that the segregation was not based on race, but on educational grounds. The English language was foreign to these children, the court argued, and they needed specialized instruction. The ruling stood. The children of the barrio continued to attend separate schools, and the insult of segregation was written into the law. For young Ramon Gutierrez, born in August of 1922, the barrio was both a prison and a sanctuary. He was the sixth of 11 children, a skinny boy with dark hair and startling blue eyes. He wore hand-me-down clothes and went barefoot when he could not find shoes. On one occasion, the school sent him home for lacking footwear. His father told the teacher that the boy would not be returning because there were no shoes for him. The teacher, a strong-willed woman from the barrio who believed deeply in education, returned an hour later with a pair of used shoes. She handed them to Ramon and said, "I will see you in school tomorrow." He never forgot that gesture. Ramon was a restless child, full of curiosity and a hunger for adventure that the barrio could not satisfy. He swam in the San Felipe Creek with the other children, a creek the white kids called the Pigpen, a name that stuck for generations. He played hide-and-seek in the streets and once, in a panic to find cover, climbed into the back of the funeral carriage kept in an empty lot. The carriage was dark and cramped, a storage space for the dead. But in the winter it was warm, and on cold nights, Ramon would slip out of the house and sleep inside the carriage, curling up among the shadows. He also discovered the railroad. At age 9, he jumped aboard an open boxcar and rode the train all the way to Chicago before he was discovered and sent home. The adventure earned him a beating, but it also planted a seed. There was a world beyond Del Rio, and he was determined to see it. As the 1930s drew to a close, Ramon took whatever work he could find. He delivered tortillas door to door, working for a small store on the corner of Tiny and Chapoy streets. He picked cotton alongside his father and older brothers, and he joined the Civilian Conservation Corps, the New Deal program that put young men to work building parks and roads. The CCC paid a few dollars a month, and Ramon signed up as soon as he was old enough. He lied about his age, or rather his mother signed the papers, thinking he was joining the CCC. When she learned he had actually enlisted in the army, she chased him out of the house with a broom. He calmed her down, explaining that he had indeed joined the CCC, not the army, not yet. But the army was paying $21 a month, and that kind of money was hard to ignore. The boys in the barrio were talking about it. They were signing up, one by one, and heading off to Fort Sam Houston. The world was changing. A war was brewing in Europe and Asia, and America was beginning to arm itself. For a boy from the barrio, the army offered something he had never known. A steady paycheck, a chance to leave, a chance to prove himself. Ramon Gutierrez and his friend Juan Yanez stepped off the bus at Fort Sam Houston in San Antonio on January 14, 1941. They stood in a long line with other new recruits. Each man issued his gear shirt by shirt, boot by boot. When Gutierrez received his boots, he realized they were the first brand new pair of shoes he had ever owned. No hand-me-downs from an older brother, no worn soles. These boots belonged to him. After basic training, Gutierrez reported to Camp Bowie in Brownwood, Texas, home of the 36th Infantry Division. An officer looked at his file and asked if he was Mexican. Gutierrez said yes. The officer handed back the file and told him to report to the 141st Regiment, 2nd Battalion, Company E. When Gutierrez walked into the company headquarters, he found himself surrounded entirely by soldiers of Mexican descent. He had stepped into an army barrio. Company E had been formed from the Texas National Guard in El Paso, and nearly every man came from the Segundo barrio of that border city. Many had known each other since grade school. Among them was Sergeant Rafael Torres, a squad leader from El Paso who took an interest in the new farm boys. Torres selected Gutierrez for his squad, along with Trinidad Perez, a sheep shearer from Rock Springs who barely spoke English. Gutierrez earned a new nickname from these men, though he did not choose it. The veterans from El Paso ran Company E, and whatever name they gave you stuck. That summer, after a week of field maneuvers, Sergeant Gabriel Navarrete and a few other Mexican-American soldiers walked into a hamburger joint in Brownwood to celebrate. A sign in the window read, "No Mexicans or dogs allowed," but they did not notice it until the white woman behind the counter refused to serve them. She told them to go around back and pick up food from the kitchen. They were wearing United States Army uniforms, but that did not change a thing. Navarrete walked straight to Captain John Chapin's office, threw his jacket on the desk, and told him he might as well join the Mexican army if this was how American soldiers were treated. Captain Chapin, a tall El Pascan, who spoke fluent Spanish and knew the culture of his men, did not hesitate. He grabbed a full colonel, and the three officers marched back into town. The colonel told the woman, "They are Americans." She was not impressed and ordered them to take their Mexicans out of her establishment. Captain Chapin and the colonel made sure the entire base knew that the hamburger joint was now off limits to all military personnel. Within days, the owner came to the base, apologized, and agreed to serve every soldier equally. The establishment was fined $500 for refusing service to the Mexican-American soldiers of Company E. The men returned to that counter, but they never forgot what it took to be treated as equals in their own army. Training intensified through the spring and summer of 1941. The division moved from Camp Bowie to Camp Blanding in Florida, where the men drilled under the scorching sun on amphibious landings and long marches. Company E earned a reputation for excellence. They were the first company to qualify every man in marksmanship, and they had held the regimental rifle championship for 8 consecutive years. The men ran faster, shot straighter, and marched farther than any other unit, and they knew it. In the fall of 1942, the division moved to Camp Edwards in Massachusetts, where Company E was chosen for ranger training with British commandos. The training was brutal. Men woke at 5 in the morning for a 6-mile speed march on the beach, followed by the most rigorous obstacle course they had ever faced. The commandos taught them hand-to-hand combat, judo, and the use of explosives. At the end of the course, each man received a USM 1918 trench knife with a distinctive handle shaped like brass knuckles. Gutierrez took the knife and carved his nickname into the handle, etching the letters into the metal with a steady hand. The knife had a blade designed for killing and a handle that could break bones. It was not a training tool, it was a weapon made for close work, and Gutierrez kept it strapped to his belt through every drill that followed. The commandos had taught them how to use toggle ropes, how to scale walls, how to move through live fire, but the knife was personal. In April of 1943, the 36th Division boarded the USS Brazil in New York Harbor and sailed for North Africa. The ship zigzagged across the Atlantic to avoid German U-boats, and many of the Texas farm boys discovered seasickness for the first time. The bunks were stacked 4 high with barely enough room to breathe, but the Navy chow was good. Gutierrez passed the time below deck playing poker and winning more than he lost. The Brazil docked at the port of Oran, Algeria on April 13th. A billboard on the hillside read, "Welcome to North Africa, 36th Division." So much for secrecy. The division moved by train to a staging area called Assi Ben Okba, then to an old French Foreign Legion post at Magenta. There the men fought heat, boredom, and a bitter yellow pill called atabrine, meant to prevent malaria but which left most of them nauseous and vomiting. Training continued under the North African sun, and the men of Company E hardened further. They practiced amphibious landings along the coast of Algeria, loading and unloading from landing craft until the movements became second nature. They guarded Italian prisoners of war and listened to Axis Sally broadcast German propaganda over the radio, promising them passes to the New Germany. The men laughed at the propaganda, but they knew the real test was coming. They had trained for nearly 3 years, from the pine forests of Florida to the beaches of Massachusetts to the desert of North Africa. Now they were waiting for the word to move. On September 5, 1943, Company E boarded the attack transport USS O'Hara off the coast of North Africa. The Tyrrhenian Sea lay calm as the convoy steamed past Sicily towards Salerno Bay. Below deck, the men cleaned their weapons and studied maps. They knew this was no exercise. They were headed for Hitler's Fortress Europe. On the evening of September 8th, a radio broadcast crackled through the ship. General Dwight Eisenhower announced that Italy had surrendered unconditionally. Cheers erupted throughout the O'Hara. Some men crossed themselves and looked to the sky, but Sergeant Rafael Torres kept cleaning his M1 rifle. When a new recruit asked if the war was over, Torres replied, "The Germans will still be there." Field Marshal Albert Kesselring had not surrendered. He climbed out of the rubble of his bombed headquarters at Frascati and set Operation Axis into motion. German troops disarmed the Italian coastal divisions and took over the defensive positions along the beaches. At Paestum, south of Salerno, the 16th Panzer Division under General Major Rudolf Siekenius waited with 88mm guns and machine guns zeroed in on the landing zones. Aboard the O'Hara, Captain John Chapin gathered his officers for the final briefing. There would be no naval bombardment of the Paestum beaches. The plan relied on surprise. The British would draw German fire in their sector to the north. Company E's job was to land, cross the railroad tracks, and seize the high ground beyond the beach. Lieutenant William Barker, a young officer from Lexington, Massachusetts, noted the plan and said nothing. He had trained with these men. He trusted them. Just after midnight on September 9th, the ship came alive with the sound of general quarters. The men filed to their boarding stations. By 3:30 in the morning, the first wave of the 141st Regiment hit the Paestum beach. German machine guns opened up immediately. Tracer rounds streaked through the darkness. The element of surprise was gone. Private First Class Ramon Gutierrez climbed down the cargo net into a landing craft with his squad. The ramp jammed as they neared the shore. Machine gun fire rattled against the steel door. When it finally opened, Gutierrez plunged into waist-deep water and struggled onto the sand. He raised his Browning automatic rifle and pulled the trigger. Nothing. Sand and seawater had jammed the chamber. After scrambling behind a stone wall, he linked up with Sergeant Rafael Torres and Private Ricardo Palacios, who helped him clear the weapon. Gutierrez found cover behind a stone wall alongside Private Juan Pruitt, a rifleman from Pearsall, Texas, who had joined Company E during the final weeks of training in North Africa. As Gutierrez worked the bar, Pruitt fired at German tanks advancing across the field. A machine gun nest to the front raked the wall. Pruitt was hit and fell dead beside him. Gutierrez reloaded and ran from behind the wall, charging directly toward the nest. German fire tore through his helmet, punching 2 holes in the steel without touching his scalp. A round struck his right arm, knocking the bar from his hands. He kept moving, flanked the nest, and pulled a grenade. He tossed it into the trench, and the explosion killed 3 Germans. He jumped into the smoke-filled ditch, and a 4th German raised his rifle. Gutierrez drove his ranger knife under the man's chin and into his jaw. The German fell dead. Nearby, Sergeant Rafael Torres spotted a Mark IV tank lumbering toward the beach. He raised his M1 and fired at the driver's slit. The tank rumbled in reverse and withdrew to the tree line. Another soldier handed Torres a 1903 Springfield rifle fitted with a grenade launcher. He loaded an anti-tank grenade, took aim at a second tank, and fired. The projectile struck the turret, and the tank retreated in a cloud of dust. Torres loaded another grenade and fired at a third tank. The round hit the ground inches short, and the tank wheeled away. A 4th tank approached. Torres fired again, hitting the rear deck. The vehicle ground to a halt, and black smoke rose from its engine. Torres moved behind a stone wall to catch his breath and began loading ammunition magazines. Machine gun fire tore through the wall. Torres was hit in the right shoulder, the force knocking him to the ground. He crawled to his friend, Sergeant Marcelino Valadez, who lay wounded in the back. The 2 men made their way toward the rear, Torres crawling backward and pulling Valadez with him. They reached Captain Chapin's command post near a large tree. Chapin called a medic and placed his own field jacket over Torres's shoulders. A medic noted the time on Torres's tag, 8:50, September 9th, 1943. 3 hours had passed since Company E hit the beach. Torres and Valadez were carried to the shore and evacuated to the USS O'Hara. In the chaos of the beach, another landing craft had taken a direct hit from an 88mm shell. Men ran through the smoke, carrying wounded comrades toward the water. By the end of the first day, the beachhead held. Company E had lost 2 men killed in action. Sergeant Manuel Gonzalez, a former Boy Scout leader from El Paso, was crushed by a German tank as he lay wounded in the open. Private Juan Pruitt from Pearsall, Texas, was killed by machine gun fire while firing from the stone wall beside Gutierrez. Many more were wounded and evacuated. General Fred Walker came ashore at noon and set up his command post in a tobacco farm. American artillery arrived and drove off the remaining German tanks. By nightfall, Company E regrouped and moved toward the hills near the town of Ogliastro, securing the right flank of the invasion force. Highway 18, the main route from the south, was now cut off to the Germans. A Russian observer attached to the 141st Regiment heard of Gutierrez's hand-to-hand fight at the machine gun nest. He sought out Captain Chapin and asked for details about the soldier who had killed a German with a knife. The observer told the American officers that this story would inspire his comrades fighting on the Eastern Front. Another soldier from Company E collected a blood-stained Nazi flag from the destroyed nest and wrapped it in his pack to send home to Laredo. First Sergeant Gabriel Navarrete, who had led the counterattack against the German tanks, was hit by machine gun fire that shattered the signal projector in his hand and drove fragments into his face. He was evacuated to a ship in the bay and later transferred to North Africa to recover. The 141st Regimental After-Action Report noted that Company E's aggressive action had kept enemy tanks from driving down to the beach itself. They had held the line. The battle for Alta Villa began on September 11th, and the fighting was among the fiercest the 36th Division had yet seen. The 143rd Regiment moved into the town at the base of Hill 424, a position the Germans had abandoned the day before. But it was a trap. The Germans, including German mechanized infantry units known as Panzer Grenadiers, had pulled back to the heights and now poured machine gun and mortar fire down on the exposed infantry below. A four-man patrol from Company L was sent to clear a gully where German machine guns had stalled the advance. Among them was a private from Pittsburgh named Charles Kelly. When a force of 70 German soldiers swarmed the patrol, Kelly opened up with his Browning automatic rifle and wiped out the machine gun crew. He fought his way back to friendly lines, killing dozens of enemy soldiers in the process. Later that day, from a three-story house overlooking the town square, Kelly worked a bar until the barrel glowed red, then switched to a Tommy gun, then a bazooka, and finally threw live 60mm mortar shells by hand at the advancing Germans. His actions that day would earn him the Medal of Honor. Company E was not part of the main assault on Alta Villa, but they moved into the area afterward to patrol and clear the town of remaining German soldiers. The work was grim. Dead bodies lay everywhere, and the September heat had accelerated decomposition. Gabriel Salazar later wrote that the smell of burning flesh from destroyed German tanks was sweet enough to turn the stomach. He hated the smell of chocolate for years afterward. For days, the men of Company E hauled corpses out of the rubble and buried them on the hillsides, the stench clinging to their uniforms. On October 13th, a familiar face returned to the bivouac area near the Sele River. First Sergeant Gabriel Navarrete had recovered from the wounds he suffered on the Paestum beach and was back with the company. The men gathered around him, slapping him on the back and asking about his time in the hospital. Navarrete was not alone in returning to duty. Navarrete was called to headquarters, where Captain Chapin and a colonel informed him he was receiving the Silver Star for his actions at Salerno. They also told him he was being promoted to second lieutenant through a battlefield commission. Navarrete thanked them, but when he learned the promotion would require a transfer to another unit, he refused. He would not leave Company E. The two officers worked out an arrangement that allowed him to stay with his men while keeping his new rank. When Navarrete walked back to the company area wearing the silver bars of a second lieutenant, the men of Company E erupted. They stood at attention and saluted, then mobbed him with congratulations. One of their own had become an officer. It felt like a victory for all of them. For men who had grown up in the barrios of El Paso and Del Rio, who had been told their whole lives that they were second-class citizens, the sight of a Mexican-American wearing an officer's bars in a combat unit was a powerful statement. In mid-November, the 36th Division was ordered to relieve the 3rd Division on Mount Rotondo. The trek up the mountain was made treacherous by constant rain that turned the trails into mud. The men slipped and struggled under the weight of their packs and weapons. When they finally reached their assigned positions, they were greeted not by silence, but by German artillery. Shells crashed into the rocky slopes, sending shrapnel screaming in every direction. The veterans of Company E knew the drill by now. They dug foxholes deep into the cold, wet earth. Thanksgiving Day, November 25th, brought no respite. The German guns continued their daily barrage. Private First Class Tirso Carrillo was outside his foxhole when a shell landed nearby and shrapnel tore into his stomach. He went down screaming. Lieutenant Barker, who was nearby, ran to Carrillo's side. He ordered one of the men to stay with Carrillo while he went to find the medic. "Do not leave this man," Barker told the soldier. He did not want Carrillo to die alone. While Barker was gone, the 2nd Battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Aaron Wyatt, arrived on the scene. He saw the soldier sitting with Carrillo and immediately ordered him to run an errand. The soldier refused, stating that Lieutenant Barker had ordered him to stay. Wyatt insisted. The soldier refused again. By the time Barker returned with the medic, Tirso Carrillo was dead. Barker confronted Wyatt about the contradicting orders afterward, but Wyatt dismissed the matter with little sympathy for the loss. 3 days later, on November 28th, the shelling resumed as it did every morning. Private Ruben Rodriguez was crouched in a foxhole next to Gabriel Salazar, showing off a crisp $100 bill he had won in a poker game. It was the first time Salazar had ever seen a $100 bill, and Rodriguez was enjoying the attention. He was the company runner, a man the officers trusted to carry messages between the front line and battalion headquarters. He was known for his intelligence and his lively conversation. A German artillery shell exploded directly on their position. Ruben Rodriguez was killed instantly. After the barrage, Wyatt arrived again. He saw the men still in shock and yelled at Lieutenant Barker. "You scared, Barker? You scared?" Then he turned to a soldier and ordered him to button his jacket and shave. The soldier, still mourning his friends, stared at Wyatt in disbelief. Wyatt showed no compassion for the loss. The exchange left a bitter taste among the men of Company E. The same barrage struck the medic, Corporal Edmund Vesti, as he was making his rounds. He had just finished talking with First Sergeant Alfonso Mojica, who had advised him to get into his foxhole. Vesti said he would be through in a minute and turned to walk away. A shell landed nearby, and shrapnel cut him down. Alfredo Lozano, a small man barely 5 feet tall whom the men called Little Bit, was also hit. Shrapnel tore into his back and hip. A lieutenant found a syringe of morphine in Vesti's kit, broke the vial with his fingers, and poured the contents directly into Lozano's wounds. December 15, 1943. The 36th Division received orders to assault the fortified town of San Pietro, a strongpoint on the German Bernhardt Line. Lieutenant William Barker, now acting commander of Company E after Captain Chapin's hospitalization, gathered his men at the base of Mount Rotondo. They had endured weeks of shelling on that mountain. Now they would move forward into the valley. San Pietro sat on a slope below Mount Samucro, its stone houses turned into machine gun nests by the 15th Panzer Grenadiers. Barker's company advanced under covering fire, clearing one building at a time. Private First Class Ramon Gutierrez fired his Browning automatic rifle from windows and alleys, covering his squad as they rushed from door to door. The fighting was close and brutal. German machine guns chewed up the streets, and mortar shells rained down from the heights. 2nd Lieutenant Gabriel Navarrete, still with Company E despite his new rank, led a charge across an open plaza to knock out a machine gun position. The men followed without hesitation, firing from the hip. After 3 days of house-to-house combat, the Germans withdrew from San Pietro. Company E held the shattered town, but the cost was visible. Bodies lay in the rubble, and medics moved among the wounded. The men knew that worse lay ahead. The Rapido River waited just beyond the next ridge. Early January 1944, Company E was pulled back from San Pietro and assigned reconnaissance patrols along the Rapido River. The stream ran fast and cold, between steep banks, its far side lined with barbed wire and German observation posts. Barker ordered his platoons to study the ground by night. Gutierrez took a position on the east bank, peering through the darkness at the opposite shore. He could see the faint shapes of pillboxes and the occasional glow of a cigarette from a German sentry. The river itself was a death trap, only 50 feet wide, but with a current strong enough to sweep a man off his feet. Sergeants reported that the Germans had zeroed in their machine guns and mortars on every likely crossing point. The 15th Panzer Grenadiers had built the Gustav Line here. and they intended to hold it. Each patrol returned with the same message: the Rapido was a fortress. Barker relayed the intelligence to battalion headquarters. The decision, however, belonged to 5th Army Commander Lieutenant General Mark Clark. He ordered the crossing to proceed as planned. Company E would lead the assault. January 20th, 1944. At dusk, Company E moved down to the east bank of the Rapido carrying rubber boats and bridge sections. The plan was to cross under cover of darkness, establish a bridgehead, and pave the way for the rest of the 36th Division. German flares began to hiss overhead almost immediately. The first boats hit the water. Machine gun fire tore into the men before they reached midstream. Mortar shells walked along the bank, killing engineers and infantry alike. Gutierrez waded into the freezing current, his bar held high, but the fire was so intense that the boat next to him was shredded, its occupants disappearing into the red-tinged water. Barker tried to direct the crossing from the bank, but the German artillery had zeroed in. The prefabricated bridges were destroyed before they could be laid. Rafts capsized. Men screamed in the dark. Navarrete, bleeding from a shrapnel wound to his arm, still dragged survivors to the east bank. "Por que la no se raja?" he shouted. "E Company never quits." By midnight, the crossing had failed. Nearly the entire company was dead, wounded, or pinned down on the enemy side. Barker ordered a withdrawal. The survivors crawled back through the mud, leaving the wounded to wait for darkness. The Rapido had become a graveyard. February 15, 1944. While the 36th Division licked its wounds, the Allies bombed the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino, believing it housed German artillery. The bombs turned the abbey into a fortress of rubble, and the Germans moved into the ruins, making the position even stronger. For the men of Company E, the news brought little relief. The division was pulled from the line near Cassino and sent to a rest area to reorganize. Replacements arrived, raw recruits from training camps in the States, but the spirit of the original company was broken. Gutierrez sat with the few remaining veterans, cleaning his rifle in silence. The weeks that followed were a blur of salvage and paperwork. The company that had once numbered 250 men now counted fewer than 40 effectives. Barker wrote letters to the families of the dead. He could not find the words to explain what had happened at the river. Word of the disaster reached Washington. The 36th Division had lost more than 1,000 men in a single night. Questions were asked. The War Department ordered an investigation, and a congressional hearing was convened in April 1944. Survivors of the 36th Division traveled to the United States to testify. Among them were men from Company E who had been evacuated or transferred. They spoke of the decision to cross the Rapido without adequate artillery support, and of the exposed positions that had turned the river into a killing zone. Lieutenant Barker was called to give a deposition. He stood before the panel and described the night of January 20th with stark precision. Survivors of the 36th Division testified that the crossing had been ordered against a prepared enemy position without adequate artillery or engineer support. Barker confirmed the men had followed their orders under impossible conditions. The hearings lasted for weeks. Mark Clark defended the operation as necessary to draw German reserves away from the Anzio beachhead. But many of the men who had bled on the Rapido never forgave him. No verdict of blame was ever issued. The controversy would linger for decades. May 28, 1944. The Fifth Army broke through the German lines at Velletri, south of Rome. Company E, rebuilt with replacements, but still carrying the memory of the Rapido, moved forward with the rest of the 36th Division. The road to Rome was open. On June 4th, the first American troops entered the Eternal City. The streets were lined with civilians cheering, throwing flowers and wine to the liberators. Gutierrez marched past the Colosseum, his bar slung over his shoulder, but he could not shake the faces of the men who would never see this day. Barker led the remnants of Company E through the Piazza Venezia. He thought of Captain Chapin, evacuated to the United States months earlier, and of all the men who had died on the Rapido. The liberation felt hollow. They had lost too much to celebrate. Alfonso Mojica, promoted in the field, walked beside the men. He carried the company's spirit in his own steady gait. "Por la no se raja," he said to a young replacement who asked if they would be sent home. The boy nodded, not fully understanding. The campaign for Italy was not over, but for Company E the worst had passed. They had survived the beaches of Salerno, the mud of Mount Rotondo, and the blood of the Rapido. Sergeant Rafael Torres, who was wounded at Salerno, was evacuated and did not return to combat. Alfredo Lozano, though badly wounded on Mount Rotondo, survived the war after months in the hospital and returned to Texas, a changed man. They had fought a war that few would remember, and they had done it as brothers from the barrio. The legacy was theirs. Gutierrez stepped off the train in Sonora, Texas, in September 1945, the war finally behind him. Connie Sanchez, who had joined the waves hoping to run into him somewhere in the world, was waiting at the station. They were married not long after, and Gutierrez tried to settle into the quiet rhythms of small-town life, but the memories of Salerno and the Rapido did not fade easily. At night, he would sometimes wake in the darkness, reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. The Silver Star and Purple Heart citations sat in a drawer, medals he rarely spoke about. He found work where he could, the same kind of labor he had done before the army, but the restlessness that had driven him as a boy was gone. What remained was a quiet determination to provide for his family, the same stubborn will that had carried him through the machine gun fire at Paestum and the freezing current of the Rapido. The ranger knife, with the name carved into the handle, had been lost on the beach at Salerno, driven so deep into a German soldier that no one could pull it free. In the years after the war, the surviving men of Company E gathered at reunions across Texas, remembering their fallen comrades and the bond they had forged in battle. They came from El Paso, from Del Rio, from the small towns scattered across the state, still recognizing one another by the set of their shoulders and the way they shook hands. For a few hours they were not farmers or mechanics or laborers, but the same company of brothers who had landed on the beach at Paestum. The motto, First Sergeant Lorenzo Luna, had drilled into them, still held, Porque la no será ya. Many of those who survived, like Alfredo Lozano, carried their wounds home and lived the rest of their lives in Texas. Others, such as Sergeant Rafael Torres and First Sergeant Alfonso Mojica, also returned to the communities they had left behind. If you have family stories from this campaign, or from any of the men who served in the 36th Division, we would be honored to hear them in the comments. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps us continue telling these important stories. Thank you for listening, and thank you for keeping their memory alive.